I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's program and remind you to silence your phones. It's especially meaningful to gather here at the Arlington Library, surrounded by the exhibit From Barriers to Ballots, as we reflect on 60 years of progress since the passage of the Voting Rights Act. The League has been a part of that story for more than a century. We are a nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering voters and defending democracy. Yes, we register voters and provide election information, but our work goes much further than that. We educate by making sure voters have the facts they need to cast informed ballots. That means everything from candidate forums, like the ones we're hosting next month, to tools like vote411.org, where you can find nonpartisan, personalized voting information. We also advocate for laws that make voting more accessible and secure. In just the last few years, Virginia has experienced one of the most significant expansions of voting access in its history, and the League has been there every step of the way. Because of this work, every voter in Virginia now has access to 45 days of early voting, no excuse absentee voting, secure ballot drop boxes, same-day voter registration, and a state Voting Rights Act that protects against discrimination and voter suppression. I agree. These changes didn't happen by accident. They are the result of decades of effort by community members, legislators, and advocates, including many in this room tonight. As we celebrate this progress, we also honor the generations who fought for these rights and remember that democracy depends on all of us. The best way to protect these gains is simple. Use them. Vote and help people vote. Before we begin, I'd like to express deep appreciation and our gratitude to the Arlington County Library and to the Arlington location. Thank you so much for being a partner in this important celebration. I've learned so much personally. And within our own league, I want to recognize Nancy Kate. Nancy led this effort on our behalf, working hand in hand with the Arlington Library to bring this conversation to life. The program you're experiencing this evening exists because of her dedication and the collaboration of so many others. Thank you, Nancy. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Diane Kresh, Director of Arlington Public Libraries. Can you hear me?
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's a rainy night, but you've all slogged through and made it. And we really appreciate your being here to participate in the conversation this evening, but also to show your support for something that's very important and fundamental to each of us, which is having the right to vote and keeping the right to vote and making sure that everyone has the right to vote. And Gretchen is here to keep us mindful of all of the things that are necessary to do. But again, thank you all. Thank you, Janelle and her team, and my programming team and marketing team for being here and providing support this evening. We're going to do quick introductions by me of each of our panelists, and then we'll go back around and each of them will say a few words about what brought them here this evening, what their interests are. We will do a deep dive into the history, like what happened before 1965 in terms of voting. We will be focusing on Virginia. We will not be talking about the state of voting across the United States, although I'm sure we have lots to say about that and what's going on. However, we will really be focusing on Virginia and more particularly Northern Virginia. So Michael will be giving us a lot of historical perspective. Mr. Henderson and Octavia will be providing a lot of information about, the personal experience. Octavia's family is what you say, 5th generation from this area?
Fifth generation.
Right. So we have those perspectives, and then as I said, Gretchen will finish up with what's changed and what is possible in voting and how voting is much better even today than it was in 1965, which in itself was a landmark milestone in the fight for civil rights and ensuring the rights and privileges of everyone. Starting on the end there is Michael Pope, a journalist for WAMU Radio. He's a podcaster and he's author of the book, the 2022 publication, The Bird Machine in Virginia. Are most of you from Virginia, so you know what the Bird Machine is, right? Lots of head nodding. Edwin Henderson is the founder of the Tinner Hill Heritage Foundation in Falls Church, whose mission is to document the history of civil rights in our region. Octavia Caldwell, who is also an associate pastor of outreach ministries at Shiloh Baptist Church in Alexandria, will share some of her reminiscences, as will Mr. Henderson. And finally, Gretchen Reinmeyer, who is the General Registrar and Director of Elections for Arlington County. And I've had the privilege of working for her on occasion as a poll worker, which if you've never done it, is, well, I mean, it's a really amazing experience. I didn't expect it maybe to touch me in quite the way that it did, but it was such a thrill to deal with people all day long, checking addresses and making sure they had the right forms and all of that, and basically exercising their civic duty that benefits all of us. So I thought it was a really exceptional experience, and Gretchen and her staff make it so. And Carol, I understand you're part of that staff as well. All right, excellent work. So we'll start again with Michael, please. A few remarks about what brought you here this evening.
Great, well, it's an honor to be here. These are actually two of my favorite organizations, the League of Women Voters and the library. How can you go wrong? So it's really great for the invitation. Thank you so much. I wanted to kind of bookend the conversation by talking about the earliest history, kind of before 1965, but then also changes since 2020. There have been a lot of changes in more recent years on voting rights and things. But, you know, the slide up there says 1965 today, but I want to take us back before 1965. And as a topic to kind of reflect on that, I want to talk specifically about the poll tax, which was outlawed in 1965. We haven't had a poll tax in Virginia since the 1960s, but it has a really fascinating history that gives you a little window into the kind of action and reaction in historical forces. So you could sort of think about this as progressive movements and then reactionary movements to react against the progressive movements. And it goes back and forth more than you think it might. So in the 1960s, the poll tax that was overturned by the constitutional amendment was not the first poll tax in Virginia, and it was not the second poll tax in Virginia. It was actually the third poll tax in Virginia. So I want to go through a little bit of that history that we can talk on our panel. So the history of the poll tax in Virginia goes back 400 years. The first poll tax was 1619. The very first General Assembly, the very first time they ever met, they created a poll tax. And the reason they did that is they needed to raise money, they needed to raise revenue for salaries. You know, like any organization, they needed to raise money to pay their people, right? So in this case, for the General Assembly, that would be the clerk, very important role, the clerk of the General Assembly. They also needed to pay the sergeant at arms, security, very important. They also needed to pay the Speaker of the House. So incidentally, the actual tax itself was 1 pound of tobacco. So you had to pay that. So now keep in mind, it's only, you know, not everyone, of course, could vote in 1619. It was not just white males, but it was property owning white males. So it was a very small group of people that we're talking about here. They had to pay the tax in order to vote. And that actually lasted for hundreds of years. So it was more than 200 years, that first version of the poll tax, dating all the way back to 1619. Then it was outlawed in 1851. Okay, so most people in this room probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking about or reading about the 1850 Virginia Constitution. I'm here to tell you how important it is, the 1850 Virginia. So for a number of reasons, everyone in this room has probably done some thinking about Virginia's history of odd year elections. Isn't it odd that we've got odd year elections? Well, guess what the reason for that is? The Constitution of 1850. And so what they did in 1850 was say, we got it all wrong with the election of the governor, because before 1850, voters did not choose the governor of Virginia. Those wealthy white men who were able to vote, who paid the poll tax and the 1 pound of tobacco, they did not choose the governor. It was the General Assembly who selected the governor. The General Assembly elected is the word they use. It was the General Assembly that elected the governor, not the voters did not elect the governor. So the Constitution of 1850, they made a lot of changes. One of them was, for example, they got rid of the 1-year term in the House of Delegates. They used to have elections every single year for the House. They said, that's a little tiring, we're not gonna do that anymore. Another change was they said voters can elect the governor instead of, the General Assembly. And so they passed the Constitution in 1850. Guess when the first opportunity they had to have the very first election for governor? 1851, odd year. Okay, so the actual origin of the odd year elections is the election for governor, the very first ever election for Virginia governor, 1851. That 1850 Constitution, the reason I'm talking so much about it is it got rid of the poll tax. So that actually dated back 230 something years, that old poll tax from the 1600s, the 1850, they got rid of it. It was part of the kind of movement at that time for what they called universal manhood suffrage. Okay, so no female voters yet, no African American voters, but in terms of white males, you no longer needed to own property in order to vote. This was actually a very big deal for the time period, relatively speaking. It was a very big deal that it was not just the landed gentry who were able to vote, it was everybody. All of the white males, they actually had a voice, they had a seat at the table that they did not previously have. So progressive for the era, a movement forward. It was a half step, but a step nonetheless, right? But then there's reactionary forces as well. So after the Civil War, there was a lot of movement kind of really fast. One of which was the 15th Amendment. This was the amendment that said black men, not women, not yet, that'll come later, black men should be able to vote, but there's reactionary forces against that, of course, and immediately in Virginia, the conservatives that ran the state after the Civil War, the Democratic Party, of course, was the group of people that seceded. They started talking about, well, what if we have a poll tax? We need to raise revenue. We've got these new public schools. We're going to raise revenue for them. So they started talking about having a poll tax in the 1870s. And then by 1876, so this is sometime after the Civil War, in fact, this is the end of Reconstruction, they had amendments to the Constitution. So, in our modern context, we talk about amendments all the time. There are 3 amendments right now that are actually under debate in the General Assembly. In 1876, they had amendments that were approved by voters that did 2 things. One of them was create a poll tax, and they brought the poll tax back. They also did something that you probably have heard of in the news called felon disenfranchisement. Okay, so there were 2 constitutional amendments in 1876. This is a reaction to the 15th Amendment. The reaction was, we're going to create a poll tax, and we're going to have felon disenfranchisement. And the reason for this is to prevent black men from voting. They were very explicit. This is the point of this poll tax, the point of felon disenfranchisement was to prevent black men from voting. So now we've got the poll tax, it's coming back. But guess what? It runs into a buzzsaw of something that is kind of forgotten in our modern world, which was the readjusters. There was the action, reaction, action, reaction, right? There were progressive forces and reactionary forces. After the Civil War, after the Civil War, the conservative Democrats took power, created the poll tax, prevented black men from voting, created felon disenfranchisement, created black men from voting. And then, out of nowhere, there is this very progressive party called the Readjusters. And so that sounds kind of a wonky name, but it had to do with the state debt. So they said, we're not going to pay the debt, let's readjust the debt. Right? And they were for creating public schools. They had a long list of things that they were in favor of, all of which were very progressive, right? Even by modern standards, were pretty progressive, one of which was getting rid of the poll tax. So they actually had yet again, another constitutional amendment to the Virginia Constitution. They got rid of that second poll tax. So this is back and forth, right? So it was the readjusters' fascinating, very brief period of time when these progressive white men worked with black men to get elected. So the readjuster party was in power only a very brief period of time, but they had a big stamp on history, one of which was to get rid of the poll tax, which, by the way, guess what? Makes a comeback, right? Reaction. In 1901, there was yet another constitutional convention. They did not like all this progressive stuff the readjusters did. They did not like the fact that black men were voting. There were several race riots, actually, that were around voting and people mad about black people voting, and specifically in parts of Virginia where you had large black populations voting. There was a reaction to that, which was they created the convention, Virginia Constitutional Convention, and wrote what I call the Jim Crow Constitution, which was 1902, that did a lot of things, beefed up the felon disenfranchisement, but also brought back the poll tax. So this is the third poll tax, right? They got rid of it once, they got rid of it twice, and here it is, brought back yet again, 1902. So the payment of the poll tax actually becomes this matter of intense concern. If you're running the Democratic Party, if you're running the Republican Party, what do you need to do to win elections? You need to get out your voters. How do you do that? Pay their poll tax, right? So there was a lot of underhanded, very illegal, shady, unethical stuff that the parties would do to pay the poll taxes of people who they thought were going to vote their way, right? So there was a lot of shady, underhanded, unethical stuff associated with actually paying the poll tax. And even, when Harry Byrd takes power and he was running the Byrd machine, a lot of people like to blame Harry Byrd for a lot of stuff, right? One of the things you frequently hear people blaming Harry Byrd, the Byrd machine for, is the poll tax. He did not create the poll tax, right? It goes back to the 1690s. Even the current version of the poll tax was created by the Jim Crow Constitution, so you can't blame Harry Byrd for that. But when Harry Byrd was running Virginia politics from his perch as a U.S. Senator for Virginia, he resisted efforts to get rid of the poll tax, right? So he could have done what other states were doing and got rid of the poll tax, and he did not do that. So you can blame Harry Byrd for keeping the poll tax around for all of those many, many years. And then we get up into the 60s when a lot of things happen in rapid succession. There's the 24th Amendment ending the poll tax, and that's obviously kind of where setting the stage for where we are. The constitutional amendment that gets rid of the third poll tax in Virginia. And then 1965, there's the Voting Rights Act, which is voted on in Congress. And so when it gets to the US Senate, guess what Virginia senators did? They both voted against it, right? There's two US senators for Virginia. One of them is Harry Byrd, votes against the 65 voting rights. The other US senator from that time period is probably less well known. It's a senator by the name of A. Willis Robertson. Okay, so you might know the last name Robertson because his son was televangelist Pat Robertson, voted against the 1965 voting rights. And yet it becomes the law, becomes to be part of the Constitution because they were on the wrong side of history. They were on the wrong side of that vote. And so we've got the 1965 voting rights. This is all setting the stage for it. And then the next year after that, Harry Byrd dies. And he's no longer around. Then 2 years after that, a Republican is elected governor of Virginia, Linwood Holton. And so the long reign of the Byrd machine is over in 1969. And the Voting Rights Act has been passed. So with that, I can yield and we can get into other topics, including the modern history.
Yes, so thank you for that very thorough background. Lots of interesting tidbits and things. I would like to spend a little bit of time on the 1965 Voting Rights Act and what it represented and what it achieved that prior to, well, what made it such a significant piece of legislation and such a milestone in terms of removing barriers to voting. So we'll start with Gretchen, and then I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel, Octavia and Edwin, to share some of your research and experience in the Black communities and the effect of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we'll start with, what is the Voting Rights Act and what did it do?
So I hope everybody knows what the Voting Rights Act did, but one of the biggest impacts that we had in Arlington County is Arlington, all of Virginia actually, was under pre-clearance requirement. So that meant any changes to Virginia election laws, including moving a polling location, consolidating a precinct, adding a precinct, all of that had to be cleared by the Department of Justice. And Arlington remained a pre-clearance jurisdiction up until 2013, when the Supreme Court case, Shelby versus Holder, made it so that we did not have to get every single action that our office did pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. And so when I started in the office in 2008, we were still a pre-clearance jurisdiction. I remember one of my biggest memories from the 2008 election is it was maybe a month before the election, and we finally got approval from the DOJ to add precinct 151, which is at the Jefferson Retirement Community Center. And it was down to the wire to get that precinct added in time for the presidential election that year. So I will say there's concern that now that we are not having to do pre-clearance and get everything approved by the DOJ, does that mean that we can just change precincts on the fly? And that's going back to, we can't, because Virginia has what's called the Virginia Voting Rights Act. So a lot of those same public notice requirements were put into place in Virginia. So we still have the same process that we were following under the Voting Rights Act. We now have to follow under Virginia voting law.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Michael talked a lot about the poll tax.
Yeah.
The literacy test was also,
Yeah.
can you tell us what the literacy test was?
So the literacy test took a couple different formats. So one of my, what I like to, do you know about blank page registration in the 1950s? So everybody has a sheet of paper in front of you. Imagine you come to register to vote in my office and I give you this. This is your application to register to vote. And so let's say, Diana, I look at you. So I might tell you, maybe you tell me if you're a citizen or not. Connie, I don't like to look at you, so I'm just gonna take your application and not help you at all. So I'm not gonna help walk you through the requirements and the qualifications of what you need to remember to put on that application in order to register to vote. I'm just gonna deny you when you forget to tell me you're not a convicted felon. So the literacy test, there's a couple different formats of literacy test, but blank page registration was one of those where you had to know the qualifications to register to vote, and maybe you got help from the registrar's office, maybe you didn't get help based on what you look like. And that was where literacy tests were, is they allowed discretion, the registrar's office, to apply discretion over who they would help, which literacy test you got, and how they would go about assisting you or not assisting you to register to vote. Does that make sense?
It does. And in our exhibit at Central Library, we do have a sample of a literacy test. So if you use the QR code, you can take the exam. I failed it, which was humbling. And it's a good example of how capricious it could be. And I've read stories of jars of things and you had to guess how many things, jelly beans or whatever were in the jar. Oops, sorry, you missed it, you can't register. So
Code citations,
All right.
language, the code section to vote by mail in Virginia. Nobody's gonna know that. So,
all right, so Edwin and Octavia, please, either one of you begin and talk a little bit about your experiences.
Okay, well, as founder of the Tenant Hill Heritage Foundation, whose mission is to research, preserve, and present African American and civil rights history. I've done a deep dive into the local history and into my genealogy. Unfortunately, I did not grow up here, even though my parents did. I grew up in a little town called Tuskegee, Alabama. And I went with my mother when she registered to vote in 1964 to the county courthouse in Macon County, Alabama. And it was a very insulting experience. She was forced to take the literacy test. And there were, you said two options. You said the blank sheet. They might ask you how many ends does it take to screw in a light bulb? Or they might ask you complicated questions about the Constitution that the average person may not know. They made my mother, who was a professor at university, take the test, and of course she didn't pass. Most of those just ended up in the round 5 anyway. But in the meantime, while we were there was a young boy, a white boy, you know, with his overalls, mud all over his boots. And he came in, and they didn't make him take the literacy test. They just signed him up, and he was able to vote. And I voted in every election since then because of that experience. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history and the capitation tax, or as you all call it, the poll tax, of which I have a ledger with my grandfather's name on it in the city of Falls Church. But even better, before then, when Falls Church became a town in 1875, an ancestor of mine named Frederick Forrest Foote, whose father owned 40 acres at Seven Corners, he was elected to the town council. Well, he was elected as the town constable, and in 1880 he was elected to the town council. And he was a Republican. So, and that was the party of Lincoln. Okay, and in Falls Church, there were a number of people, including Colonel Crocker. Some people might call him a carpetbagger, but he was an officer in the United States Army, settled in Falls Church, and he would go between. He would buy land, and then he would sell it to African Americans, and there was a large population of African Americans along what is today Annandale Road. Back then it was called Shreve Road. And so these were the people that helped to elect Frederick Forrest Foote. But when he was elected to the town council, there was a movement by the Democrats, who basically controlled the town council, to gerrymander and retro-seed that portion of the town out of the town into Fairfax County. And that's what they did in 1887. So gerrymandering, retrocession, those were common tactics. We talked about the capitation tax or the poll tax and the literacy tax. But also, there was a lot of zoning, particularly in African American communities, from farming to residential to business. And each one of those changes raised taxes of African Americans, forcing them out of their property, such as my Frederick Forrest Foote's father, Frederick Forrest Foote Sr. And they could no longer afford the taxes. And the judge in 1953 ordered that the property be sold, set the price at $400,000, and then they built a big shopping center there. And so these were kind of things, and also the house where I live in, to my grandfather's house, it was an acre and a half, and then they decided they wanted to build a highway to honor a Confederate general named Robert E. Lee, and they cut right through the black community, cutting off 1 acre from the other half where the house was. The barn was on one side, the house was on the other. The cow got loose one night and got hit by a car, and my grandfather was forced to fix the guy's car, you know. And eventually they sold the acre on the other side because it was just inconvenient. So things like eminent domain, condemnation. These kinds of policies were done to African American communities to force them out of their property or to tax them out of their land.
Can we just do a quick, refresher on, does everyone know what eminent domain is? Quick, everybody's nodding, but you know. Just-
Oh, that's when they can take your land, they don't really take it, but they don't pay you hardly what it's worth.
Yeah.
And
So that happened to my family in
Did it?
the early 60s because of something called Route 66. And they came to the door, knock, knock, guess what? And there were a series of houses that were all taken, quote unquote, by the highway, which then wasn't built for about another 15 years. But in the meantime, families were uprooted, and so I understand a little bit about it from that perspective. And you also mentioned condemnation. You're talking about property, condemning property?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what
A
were,
lot of times that's associated almost with eminent domain.
okay,
For the instance, okay, we're talking about voting. I used to teach, as well as my colleague here, at a school named Luther Jackson. Luther Jackson had a organization called the Virginia Voters League. And he encouraged people to pay your poll taxes so you can vote. I have several letters from him as well. Okay, but Luther Jackson originally was a high school, the first high school in Fairfax County where blacks could attend. However, the way that they got the land, there were 4 parcels of property that were considered for the building of the black high school. 3 of them turned out to be either owned by whites or they would allow them to say no. But there was a black woman who was a widow, Octavia Stone, Octavia Stone. And they offered her a small amount of money. It's about $500 an acre or less. No, it was less than that. When she didn't accept it, they condemned her land and took it and offered her the same amount of money. So it was very devious how some of these things were done
sure.
at that time. And we always say, oh, it was so great, you know, to have the first black high school and all that. But if you look at the way it was done, it's very backhanded.
Thank you, Edwin, for those reminiscences. Octavia?
Good evening, everybody. And I attended Parker Gray High School, and Parker Gray and Luther Jackson had a very strong competition. Parker Gray was the Alexandria high school for African Americans. And we always enjoyed the games. There were a lot of fights between the games, but the football and the marching band competitions were what everybody went to the games to see. So I do remember. My family is based in, we actually, my aunt really is the family historian. And we have researched our family background, and we have a bill of lading for a relative that came off the slave ship and moved to West Street, and they lived on, my grandparents lived on King Street. I am 5th generation Alexandrian. I grew up in Alexandria. And it was segregated, and we didn't know. We children didn't know, and our parents did a good job of kind of sheltering us. But I sat around and listened to the conversations that the men would have. And so I grew up in a household and a family that was involved with community action. Things locally that needed to happen or they wanted to happen, and I would hear their conversations and them making plans. And my grandfather ran for city council in Alexandria. He actually became a justice of the peace in the city of Alexandria. And so I'm listening to those conversations, so in my mind, that's what we do as an adult. You just get involved in your community, and so I can. Very honestly, I'm in the age group that a lot of activism during the 60s took place. My son loves to tell people that his mother was a card-carrying member of the Black Panther Party, and I was. Black Panthers did a lot of community development. They, a lot of programs that they ran in terms of helping the community people didn't know about, because that's not what they wanted to. The only thing the press wanted to talk about was the fact that they had guns. They were very militant about protecting the community that they lived in. They started food distribution programs. They started job development programs. And they did that all over the United States, including in Alexandria. H. Brown, and I'm hoping you all remember who H. Brown was, actually was arrested and put in the Alexandria jail. We lived in the Burg, which was one of the concentrating communities where the blacks were. My grandfather was who they called to kind of calm everybody down, which everybody didn't know exactly where about from. And they came to Alexandria rather than DC because they didn't know what they could do, you know. They were trying to avoid a riot happening. I ended up going to undergrad school, initially in Jackson, Tennessee. Because of the student protests, we ended up, that I was very much a part of, they ended up shutting the school down for a while, and I had to come back home. I went to undergrad school in 1968. Wallace was running for president in 1968, and Jackson had a big banner across downtown Jackson that it was Wallace country. And so I led a group of students. We were only up the street from the convention center, and I led a group of students down to the convention center to interrupt the Wallace rally that was happening at the Constitution, at the convention center. And we passed Ku Klux Klansmen standing in the street, fully robed, and it was interesting, the reaction of us from what they call the North, who had not really faced the Ku Klux Klan, and the reaction of the students that were there from the more southern states that had actually had confrontations with them. They already went back to campus. Foolish us went down anyway. I did not go back to Jackson. I finished my undergraduate work at George Mason University. Again, this was in '74. And Virginia was one of the last states that actually integrated their school systems. And George Mason University, we were one of the first classes that African Americans come in. And so the year we went was the fall of '74. And we started an organization called UJA, Political Action Organization. And we wanted to have something during Black History Week. And we went to the student government to try to get some money. They told us we should have submitted it the year before. We weren't getting the year before, so certainly there has to be some kind of a process that would give us as funds, and they said no. So I decided I read the Constitution, the student government Constitution, and discovered that it's the student government president that decided what organizations got money. I decided I needed to run for student government president. At that time, there were 6,000 students at George Mason University. And of those, it was still a community school. And of those 6,000 students, there were only 100 African Americans. And I decided to run for student government president. And I won. I did not announce my candidacy. I did not announce my candidacy. I just filed everything at the last minute. took advantage of general student apathy and ended up being elected. To this day, I'm the only African-American president and female. Now, how I won was in the 70s, women's lib was a big deal. And they had never had a female president in student government before. And the largest population has always been, George Mason has always had a large population, international population, and most of them were from Africa. So I went to my folk over in Africa and talked to them about supporting me. The women supported me because they didn't have a, and so we were able to have that victory. Now I mention that because local politics is the most important. It affects us closely. And so, again, my family encouraged us, be active. I mean, they wouldn't let me do one thing, so it's like, okay, let me find out how I can do it. I have always been a proponent, because of my parents, you need to know the rules of engagement in the system that you're in. And once you know the rules of engagement, you make sure you know how they work. I still do that as the Charlotte Baptist Church is one of the oldest churches in the African-American churches in the state of Virginia. They are getting ready to celebrate 162 years, 162, 63 years. And I'm serving as the associate pastor of outreach ministries for that church. That's the ministry that basically does services, ministries to the public. Included under that umbrella is social justice. Social justice is very broad. Our three pillars are, we do ministry to those who are behind bars and their families. We have a reentry program to help them once they decide to come back into society. And then there's an education and advocacy piece, which I love. And so we have been involved in registering people to vote, helping those who are being released from prison. Virginia is one of the states that allows them to vote. But they did not do a good job of helping them understand what they needed to go through in order to have that right to vote. And so we often have not just expungement, but programs to help them with the application. When we do our voter registration, we usually have a table to help them register, fill out the application so that they can reclaim their right to vote that they lost being incarcerated. I like knowing what systems we are working in so that we can make sure those systems don't work against you. Alexandria, Northern Virginia, has kind of been protected or insulated against some of the other things that are happening in the state of Virginia that prevent people or are barriers to people actually getting to vote. In the last election, does everybody know what redistricting is? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of things that are against the law, both the 2010 Virginia Voting Rights Act as well as the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But redistricting is one of the ways today that is used as a barrier to people voting. There were people in the last election that were involved in redistricting. They had been going to a polling place, that's where they go vote, and all of a sudden, the redistricting changed their polling place where they could go vote. They weren't necessarily informed. And so they would go and then get there and find out, oh, that's not where you're gonna go, you're gonna go over there. And sometimes they just go, even later, I don't feel like going through all of that. And then sometimes they would, by the time they got there, it was too late to vote. So we need to, and then there were, so we need to watch Virginia has done a good job with their redistricting process. One, because it's independent. A lot of states, their redistricting is done by the legislature. In Virginia, it's done by an independent. They didn't take the politics out of it because it's still half Republican, half Democrat, and it's the same number. So it's hard to break the tie because it's 6-6 that there are things that come up and they don't happen because of the politics that they're still involved in redistricting. However, Virginia is a lot better than some of the shenanigans going on in places like Texas with redistricting. But we need to, it happens every 10 years. And some states do it mid-10 years. And Virginia decided that it would not be a mid-10 years, which is good. But again, I mention that because we need to be aware when redistricting is happening, we need to be involved in that process. There are opportunities for public engagement in that process. And they advertise it, but very few people actually take advantage of it. And so as an advocate, one of the things that I like doing when I talk to people is helping them know the ways they can engage in the processes, the electoral processes. Even now, and I'm sure our head of elections in Arlington County would agree, there are things, just because something is the law does not mean local government necessarily is following that. And when it's not, we have redress. And if we don't take advantage of it, I mean, even when, back in the day when they were doing the literacy test, they would ask questions that they just knew Black people would know answers to. And if they knew the answers, then they have to come up with something else, trying to not intimidate them, because we knew when we went there, we were going to be tested, so we were prepared for the crazy questions that they were going to ask. And I think we still have to be just as informed today. We still have to help, and the sad part is there are people who don't understand, there are young people there who do not understand what we went through to get the rights that we have today. And so, as outreach, one of the things that we do with voter registration is we try to come up with events to hear from people, why are they disenfranchised? Why are they disconnected to the electoral process? And it's because they really don't believe that their vote, their voice makes a difference. And I am a very strong proponent of, I believe that I still believe in the power of the vote. I still believe that we as a people have a right, just because something is done doesn't mean it has to stay that way. We can change laws that are in place, and that's part of what the Voting Act 2021 attempted to do, and has done to a large extent. But when we have a group of people that are intent on taking the right to vote away from people, they will find a way to do it. And locally, they can get away with it because the people that are impacted by what they do are not going to necessarily say anything because it's real local, everybody knows everybody, and so we are not complaining, and they count on that. But this is still a country and a state of the people, by the people, and for the people, and the only reason it's not is the people advocate their role. And so I like encouraging people and making people aware of opportunities as well as actions that they can take to protect their right to vote and make sure that if anyone tries to interfere with their voting, what they can do. We were even told one year in Alexandria, and I can't remember the exact year, but we were taking water to people and serving people who were in the line. And we were told that we could not serve water to people who were waiting in line. We knew we could, so we didn't stop. We kept going. We would call the police.
Georgia.
Been to jail before, we can go back again, and recently in Georgia, you're right, they did also. So, we just need to make sure that we are aware and that we help others be aware of what their rights are and their remedies, so when necessary, they can take those rights and remedies and then I'll pass it on.
No, thank you, that was excellent. Thanks. You talked about your own advocacy and activism. A big feature of the exhibit that we presented at the library, the voting rights celebration, if you will, features the role of activists, people who were just kind of ordinary people who took a big risk. Portia Haskins from Halls Hill, who was a plaintiff in a successful case, and John Robinson, the late John Robinson, probably known to many of you, a community activist in Green Valley, who on election day would go around in his car with a bullhorn and say, "Get out to vote." And sometimes we think, well, you know, what can I do? Little old me, I can't make a difference. And those are terrific examples of people who went probably way out of their comfort zone and made something happen that benefited not only themselves, but their communities and all of us. And I also want to call out my friend, Dr. Scott Taylor, director of the Black Heritage Museum, who's one of our partners in putting on the exhibit that we have. You see a couple of panels here this evening. We were also joined by the Arlington Historical Society, and of course the leagues were very supportive of, I don't know, not only celebrating, but as you were saying, Octavia, teaching, letting people know that it just doesn't happen. And what didn't we all wake up one day and, oh, yay, barriers removed, done. And on that note, we're going to turn to Gretchen and talk about not only where we are today, but what maybe still needs to be done.
Okay, so as we know, the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Did all of Virginia's problems go away then?
Yes.
No. Okay. So one of the things that I learned at the library's presentation was Miss Portia Haskins' story. So immediately following the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Portia challenged the dual voter registration system that was in place in Virginia. Virginia ran separate voter registration requirements for federal elections and state elections. So going back to the poll tax, while the poll tax was removed for federal elections, Virginia's like, hey, wait, we can still use the poll tax in Virginia statewide elections. Well, Portia took her case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and she won, and that's what finally took away the poll tax in Virginia state elections as well. So I want to fast forward. So I'm talking about from 1965 onwards. I'm going to highlight some really kind of expansions of Voting Rights Act. So the first, I'm going to jump to 1975, which is when we started adding amendments to the Voting Rights Act. So one of the most frequently cited Voting Rights Act amendments or sections today is Section 203. And this section is what requires Fairfax County to translate materials into Spanish and Vietnamese and Korean. And it's because they have a high enough population, a language minority speaking population in their jurisdiction, that they're required to provide all election materials in those languages. That hasn't gone away and it's not going away. So quick show of hands, how many of you guys have heard of Motor Voter? So this is the common name of a federal legislation called the National Voter Registration Act, which passed in the 90s. And it allowed voters to register to vote at the DMV. When I was growing up, it was the big law at the time. That's all I heard about was Motor Voter for like the 90s. So prior to this in Virginia, and I think it's really important to see how far we've come and how quickly things have gone since the 90s. So prior to the passage of Motor Voter in the early 90s, voters in Virginia had to register to vote in person in front of a sworn assistant registrar of the local elections office. You couldn't mail in a registration, you couldn't register at the DMV, you had to find an assistant registrar, sworn assistant registrar in your jurisdiction and go register to vote in person in front of him. And that was the law from the 70s, 1968, 69 in Virginia, all the way up to the 90s. So today, just to give you an idea of how impactful this law was, 62% of Arlingtons are registering through the DMV still to this day.
Wow.
So that is how a majority of voters in Arlington are registering to vote. So in addition to being able to register to vote at the DMV, Virginia also has something called automatic voter registration, or what might also be called an opt-out state. So when you go to the DMV in Virginia, and this only passed in the last 5 years, when you go into the DMV in Virginia, any transaction you do, you have to opt out of registering to vote. So you're automatically going to be registered to vote, and you're automatically going to have your registration changed to the address where that DMV transaction is taking place. As you can imagine, this might cause some confusion for people that might have more than one address in Virginia, but by and large, we've seen it work very successfully in getting people registered to vote here in Virginia. So in addition to registering at the DMV, Virginia also now has online voter registration. So in addition to the 62% registering through the DMV, 23% of voters in Arlington are registering online with their Virginia DMV ID. So this means that 85% of voters in Arlington have had their information verified by the DMV when they're registering to vote. So how many of you have gotten your real ID? Was it an easy thing to do, or did you have to go through a lot of identity checks?
Easy.
So one of the, it's the challenge. So 85% of voters in Virginia have gone through some kind of like rigorous ID check at the DMV. So when we talk about modern election laws, and I think some of this is the reaction that Michael was talking about, I like to see it as this tension between you have security on one side and transparency on the other, and integrity on one side and access on the other. And it's this tension between security and access that keeps pulling here in the laws. And I imagine most of you have seen a news story, and maybe even the past few days, where you can see this tension of security versus access and that tension. And we have policymakers and we have advocates on both sides of this tightrope, and that they keep pulling the election laws back and forth across this line. So when we talk about extending voter registration through the DMV, that's expanding access, but we've been able to do it in a way that has allowed that integrity and that security and the ID check still in place. You can do both at the same time. So moving past voter registration to talk about actual law changes at the ballot box when you go cast your vote. So here too, Virginia has greatly expanded access here in the last few years. So in 2020, we had adopted no excuse absentee voting, which paved the way for early voting, 45 days of early voting, and you now no longer need a reason to request a mail ballot. The next year, the mail ballot program was further expanded, so now we have something called a permanent absentee ballot list. So any voter in Virginia can request to get a mail ballot automatically for every election. We also now require paid postage on those return envelopes. So we talk about the poll tax. Some have said that having to pay for a stamp to return your ballot is a version of a poll tax. So in Virginia now we are required to provide prepaid postage on those ballots to get back to our office. In addition to that, here in Arlington, you can use one of the 24-hour drop boxes. Prior to August of 2020, drop boxes were not allowed in Virginia. And it was the special session in 2020 that allowed us to have drop boxes or mail ballots. Yeah. And Bob Brink, former delegate and chair of the state board, was instrumental in that passage, that bill. And now back to voter registration. So voters can now do same-day registration and cast a provisional ballot. And the most recent change to Virginia elections law is the voter registration deadline has been moved from 21 days before the election to 10 days before the election. So voters now have 11 more days to register before each election. So each of these expansions wasn't done without a regard for security integrity. So drop boxes are monitored with cameras here in Arlington. Online voter registration requires a match to the Virginia DMV ID. You cannot register online without a Virginia DMV ID, for good or bad. So the permanent absentee ballot list can only be mailed to your address here in Arlington. The post office cannot forward ballots, and any ballots returned to our office marked undeliverable triggers an address confirmation process for a voter. So we're not just mailing ballots to every person, and those ballots are being tracked on the way back to us. So, and then I also want to highlight and make sure we don't forget that Virginia does have the Virginia Voting Rights Act, which I've already talked about. So I want to end my comments with 3 asks from the audience here today. So the first is I really want everyone to practice reframing the conversation of election laws in this theme of a competition between security and access. And I think that if we do this and we stop trying to talk about it in ways of disenfranchisement or voter fraud, because when we use these terms, the two sides are talking past each other. And if you can't incorporate the concerns of the other side into your laws or what you're putting forward, then you're never going to reach a consensus and we're never going to move forward. So let's keep it and reframe with this idea of security and access, and where is the appropriate amount of access and the appropriate amount of security or safeguards that we can put into a new program. Second, I too believe of a government of by and for the people. So I'd ask everyone today to contact their legislators when they go home and either thank them for one of the bills that passed to either expand access here in Virginia, or to tell them how you want to further expand access for increased security in Virginia's elections. They'll love to hear from you. And then the final thing, because I too agree that voters need to be prepared to protect their rights. So trust has to be earned. And I recognize and appreciate that you might not trust me here today. So if you want to protect yourself in your vote for this fall, you can do one of 2 things. The first thing is you can go to the citizen portal that the state of Virginia provides at vote.virginia.gov, and you can enter your information, look up your record, and you can grab a screen grab on your phone or just print that off. If you're not computer literate, that's okay. You can call your local office and request them to mail you your voter card, and that information will protect your right to vote this fall. Because on it, if something should happen, let's say you have a really common name, and we move Mary Hill from one jurisdiction to another, if you have that voter confirmation document with your voter ID number on it, we will be able to do the research we need to do to be able to make sure that your vote will be counted. Does that make sense? So 3 asks. That's great. Thank you.
It's impossible to pay any attention to national news and not be aware of comments about voter fraud, existing fraud, perpetual fraud, worries about whether there will continue to be free and fair elections. And aside from having people call you and be reassured that we're safe here in Arlington, what are some ways that each of us as citizens can dial down the dialogue? Because it's harmful. I mean, people hear that, well, there's now an executive order and we're going to get rid of, mail-in voting. Unless you're willing to inform yourself, that's the message that you're getting, and it could be a detriment and a barrier for a lot of people. So what role can we as citizens working with your office do to tamp down all of the misinformation?
It's a really good question. I would like to say anybody who does have concerns can call our office. I like to say we run an election therapy hotline each election. This is what we're here to do and I realize emotions are running very high in elections right now. And that's unfortunately, like I said, the media and even some of our elected officials are trying to make news and make a bigger deal out of something than it really is. So I'm still here. I'm still running elections according to the laws that have been in place that I've been doing for the last 15 years. And I'll continue doing what I'm doing and what I've been told to do until, Yeah, until I'm not told to do it, so.
Move on to become the library director.
Yeah.
Michael, thoughts, because you're also a journalist, and so you're in this world all the time reporting the news. Thoughts?
Well, she just blamed my profession, the media, so I would say some media.
Some media, but to the media's credit, so I'll just, the example that I have, so our governor just signed an executive order yesterday about, election security things. Most of those things in the executive order have already been a part of Virginia law and have already been done we've already been doing them. And so now you have politicians on the other side who are expressing outrage at this executive order, but that's been the law. And so the media is just picking up on some of this conversation that's out there from the two sides of security and access pushing against each other. And so we need to be able to read through that and get through to the story about the real story behind and what's the motivation behind the things that are coming out.
I would go back to your comments about the DMV, and
Yes.
It's news to me. Most people are registering to vote for the first time through the DMV. I think that's a really important salient fact. There is a wrinkle in that I'd like to bring to your attention, which is the form when you're at the DMV, you're filling out, here's my name, and here's my address and everything. At the top of the page, there's this box that says, "Are you a citizen?" It's really easy to overlook that box and not check it, or perhaps there's a clipboard.
So
And it's-
that has not been the case since 2019, when we stopped using paper applications at the DMV, and now the application voters are presented with it still has its problems, but it's a little credit card machine. So yes, in the paper application, people would forget to check that checkbox.
Well, but even my understanding of this, but the reason I bring all this up is because this became an issue last year.
Yep.
When the DMV had a long list of people who had not checked the appropriate box to say, I am a citizen. And there could have been many reasons for not having checked that box that had nothing to do with not being a citizen.
Yes, so it's electronic now, it's not a sheet of paper, but you're not wrong, you are right on this point. So how many of you, when a pop-up comes on your computer screen, you just click no? You're like, no, go away, I'm tired of these pop-ups. So you've just gone to the DMV and all you want to do is update the address on your car registration. And now you're getting asked, do you want to register to vote? Are you a US citizen? Have you been convicted of a felony? You're getting presented with all these things. And at some point in that process, you're like, I'm done. No, please go away. Well, now you've checked a box that says, no, you're not a citizen, and that information has been transmitted to our office. And this is one of those areas where I would like to see the legislators address so that we have more discretion or more information at the local level to decide, is this person a US citizen or did they accidentally check the wrong box at the DMV?
So this is really important stuff because the DMV has this list of people who, according to the DMV, have at some point not declared that they are a citizen
No,
in
they
some way.
declared that they are not a US citizen.
Well, they either left the box, it depends on how you want to read it.
No, they can't leave the box blank. You either have to say you're a citizen or you're not a citizen, because paper forms are gone now. They've been gone for 6
Well,
years.
we might be talking about different things, because I think there's DMV forms and then there's register to vote forms. So there's a variety of ways the DMV has information. Regardless, the DMV is not the expert on immigration status, right? So the DMV has this list of people that for whatever reason, they think this list of people are not citizens. And that's the list that went to the election people that created the purge. All the people were purged. As it turns out, this was full of errors. There were many people on that list who were in fact citizens and should have been able to vote, but they were kicked off of the list. Some of whom were kicked off the list, went through the process to make sure that they were reinstated, and then they were kicked off again. So,
Because they stay on the list,
yeah, so this is the list that is actually very important in terms of the voting purges that are going on. Another thing that I wanted to comment on, you said call your lawmakers, about expanding voting rights. One of the really important things that happen in the General Assembly is they often reject efforts to roll back some of these things. So a lot of these changes happened in the 2020 General Assembly. It's actually pre-pandemic. In our minds, we associate them with the pandemic because they kind of all happened at the same time. But in reality, the 2020 session happened before the pandemic. So the 45 days of early voting and the same day registration, and a lot of these reforms actually had nothing to do with the pandemic. They just, the timing happened to coincide with each other. So one of the things that frequently we see in Richmond at the General Assembly session is efforts to roll back the 45 days. The Republicans really don't like the 45 days. And in fact, the main senator in charge who's like leading the efforts to roll back the 45 days is a state senator from Lynchburg, who is also chairman of the Republican Party of Virginia. So he's the guy that wants to roll back the 45 days. He thinks 2 weeks is a good time period. When you talk to the Republicans about this, which I do often, in fact, I spoke to one yesterday, they said, well, it's too expensive. Chad Green is one of these. So I make a habit of talking to all the candidates that are in the really competitive elections, of which there are like a dozen this year, House elections. So Chad Green is one of the Republicans in the peninsula. So I'm following his campaign. He's also one of the Republicans that wants to roll back the 45 days. He says 45 days is too long. What about 2 weeks? And it costs a lot of money. He's done a lot of math, and he'll tell you it costs $2 million to $4 million a year. I don't know about the math, but I mean, there is some cost associated with it. He feels like that cost is too much. He also, and you heard this a lot from Republicans, believe it's a burden on registrars. So they'll. So
133 registrars in Virginia will agree that 45 days of early voting is a lot.
Yeah.
I'll just put that out there. Yeah.
But I always find it really interesting when you go to the General Assembly, there's a lot of transparency in the process. And so they'll have a bill and they'll say, anybody who wants to speak on this in favor of this bill, stand up and speak in favor of it. And then they'll get up and stand. Anybody who's against this bill, stand up and speak against it. So you have a lot of like League of Women Voters frequently speaks in favor or against things. Like on the rolling back to 45 days, I remember, because I was there, the League of Women Voters spoke out against the senator from Lynchburg's bill on rolling back the 45 days.
Can I just speak to, because it's a very partisan issue, and registrars and electoral board members try to very concernedly not weigh into partisan issues. We are nonpartisan administrators, and I will administer elections according to laws of Virginia. But to this idea of 45 days being overwhelmed, it's really important to keep in mind that we have 133 election administering jurisdictions in Virginia. Arlington is the 9th largest jurisdiction in Virginia. I have a staff of 9 people. To run early voting for 45 days, I have to triple the size of my staff. In office, the size of Falls Church or Fairfax City, they have 3 employees. We now have to be open, and these are good things. We have to be open 2 Saturdays before every election. We have to be open on Sunday now here in Arlington. So those 3 people, every election, whether it's a primary or a general, they have to say goodbye to their families and work for 3 weeks straight, because you're working the weekend after the election, because of all the provisional ballots and everything, and the post-election audit and everything you have to do after the election. So I understand this idea that if we roll it back at all, that it is this idea that we are going to take away our rights. But we as a state, as a community, have to understand the impact that some of these smaller local election offices are under and how much work they have to do. And we didn't even have full-time registrars in every jurisdiction in Virginia until about 10 years ago. We still had 5 jurisdictions that only had a part-time registrar. Those offices were only open 3 days a week. And now they're having to be open for essentially 3 weeks straight. It's moved quickly, and our offices haven't been supported and funded and staffed the way we need in order to keep up with these laws.
I'd like to add two additional things. One is an additional perspective on toning down the fraud, the voter fraud. And that is, I still think that we need to be watchful, especially in local elections, because there are things that can happen that may not be legal. And I think if we don't stay on top of it and not aware of it and not watchful, it's very possible. I mean, there's still a lot of questions about how legitimate the last election was, and everybody's kind of waiting still for the romance to blow over, and then they start telling on each other and bringing stuff out. We, the United States, are being watched by other countries that are moving toward, I'm also a missionary, I travel other countries, and they are watching us as they are thinking about implementing democratic processes. And so how we protect and make sure, yes, we want to make sure we're going to have security, and we need the transparency, but we also need to be aware of technology and how it can impact some of our results. And there are ways that we can protect, make sure that those things are secure. So I think we may not need to get as involved in a lot of the charge acting on fraud, but I don't think we need to not be watchful so that we can, if it occurs, we can be on top of it. And then the other is there are things that as individuals, and I'll share just a couple of things that our church is doing to encourage people to vote. We still need to make sure, we need to register people, that's true, but in a number of the more recent elections, there are people who have won by small margins because the number of registered voters that voted was so small. So we need to, so one of the things that we're doing, and I laughed when you talked about the votercade, because we actually did a votercade through the city. We got a license. And just went through reminding people with the bull horns and the horns blowing and the cars decorated. And it started with some of the areas in, like the Tidewater area and in Richmond. We got the idea from them. And so we and continue to do, and as we rode around the city, blowing our horns and yelling, my granddaughter rode with me and she kept screaming and embarrassing her. But people were giving us high fives, and there were some people that said that they appreciated the reminder so that they could go out and vote. We've also done souls to the polls,
Right.
gotten people to walk down, and everybody did not know that they could vote on Sunday. So on Sunday, a couple of the churches got together and we walked down to the poll down in Old Town Alexandria, and we did one year we did a gospel concert. We invited different churches to come and sing, and the singing attracted people, and then we had tables. And I think that when the voters came out on that, we had some of the sororities and fraternities, and just help people go across the street and vote. They didn't know that they could vote on Saturday. So I think we as individuals need to talk to our family members, talk to our neighbors, talk to our co-workers, make sure we vote, and then make sure we let people know how important it is for them to vote and their voice to be heard.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Can I
yes.
say something? The environment is so toxic right now that a lot of people are exhausted. And that is very indicative of the last election when 20 million people less voted, less last time than they did the election before. And not that I'm a fan of, but I think you've got it right about getting youth involved and interested in voting, because they have the most to gain or lose behind all of this. And by getting people out, getting people interested. I had a conversation with a young woman who was in her 30s before the last presidential election. And she was telling me all the reasons why she was not going to vote. And we tried to impress on her, she was African American. And, all of the people that have, sacrificed so much for us to vote that, it kind of goes against, your own legacy, your own people not to vote. And for some reason, young people are not interested in voting. I think part of it's toxicity, but part of it is them not knowing the sacrifices that people went through so that they could vote. So there's a lot of work to be done.
There is a lot of work to be done. And, young lady, you had a question earlier.
Yeah, I did. So, I just wanted to point out to Michael and Gretchen that I think you were talking past each other. I think the reason that some people's voting registrations reflect that they hadn't checked that they were citizens is because they registered 15 years ago and they could vote. They hadn't had to re-register, and so they're going back and looking first time because of the situation that we're in now, that the immigration pushes to check people's. And then now it's not happening because we have electronic cards, but anyway, that's just my point. But the other thing I want to ask Gretchen is, I don't know what has happened in Virginia with this request from the federal government, but I think this is a type of voter intimidation or suppression when the feds ask the state and the local registrars to cough up every piece of information you have on the voter, not just the ones that, used to be able to, if the Arlington Democrats want a list of voters and addresses, they can pay for it and get it. But now, the feds want not just the names and addresses, but every single demographic that you have collected. And if it's using the DMV records, they know every address they've ever had, they know the color of their eyes, it's just so invasive. And I think people read that and think it's happening. I don't know if it's happening in Virginia, but what is the response to that? And I can see a lot of people saying, well, I'm not going anywhere near that voter registration if that's what I'm giving up. Or not that we haven't already all given it all up, and if that's fair, but.
So the ironic part is the legislation that allows federal DOJ, federal oversight in elections is the Voting Rights Act. But to your point is, I don't know what's been shared. I don't know what's been shared, and I'd recommend if you have concerns as a voter to contact the Department of Elections and start asking questions. We do have, it's been part of Virginia law for a long time, that registered voters are supposed to be checked through the SAVE database. That wasn't an option up until recent changes to that SAVE database. So I don't know if we're just now able to do the things that have been a part of Virginia law for a long time, or if data has been transferred over en masse to the Department of Justice. I don't know the answer for you, but contact the Department of Elections, start asking some questions.
Okay, so we have segued into the question and answer part of the program. So we'll do as many as we can. We do probably need to wrap up by 10 of, so that staff can leave, et cetera. So let's just spend the next 10, 15 minutes, grab a cookie, get your questions ready. Please make sure it's in the form of a question. People are already fleeing, so, yes, sir.
Okay.
So I wanted to pick up on what was comment about youth. This is very important. And ask a question of Gretchen, which is, do you have any estimates of how many people that are eligible to register that are not registered? And then the Gretchen mentioned you, in your own community, other than DMV and Ballots, are there efforts to register young people? So Gretchen first.
No, I do not know. So it's very hard to get to what's called voter eligible population. Census does track some of that data because you have to get to the people who are over the age of 18, who are US citizens, and we just don't have that. It's always going to be an estimate. So I don't know. What I do know, because I processed a lot of mail ballot applications today, we've got a lot of mail ballots going out to a lot of colleges here for Arlington voters. So there's a lot of 2007 birthdays that are requesting mail ballots. So if that makes you feel old, that.
I think the whole is that we still need to work on.
Yeah, and one of the things that Virginia also has is pre-registration, which allows 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. That's also one of those new bills. So one of the things that I believe the League of Women Voters does is they go to each high school here in Arlington and they start registering those 16 and 17-year-olds. And once that kid turns 18, then they're automatically registered to vote. Registering is the easy part. Getting them to the polls and getting them to vote is a separate conversation.
We partnered with, North Virginia Community College. We did a voter registration at one of the large apartment complexes, and, a lot of students lived there, but then we also, got permission from the school to do voter registration on the campus. And we'll probably do more of that, as well as some, opportunities for them to come and talk. And you're right, we do have to do a more aggressive job of reaching young people across the board, listening to them to find out what their issues are, and then giving them the information to help them deal with what those issues are. You're welcome.
Okay. Also, I wanted to say, Portia Haskins will be at the museum next month. I hope you guys come out because we don't have too many lessons left. So it's good. But I'm going to throw some things at you. You don't have to answer all of this. Just these are things that I'm worried about. And the one thing is how significantly the Supreme Court's decisions are weakened by the Shelby County versus Holder Act. And I'm hoping somebody can talk a little bit about that. Also, the voter ID laws, which kind of hurt senior people, and some really young people. What we can do about that. Gerrymandering. You talked a little bit about felony disenfranchisement. I mean, you've done your time to be able to vote, and what can we do to get these people to be able to vote? And also the new laws that restrict mail-in voting, early voting, and the number of polling places that have these long lines. So those are things I mean, you have to answer all of it, but maybe a couple of things you can get your idea on.
Go ahead, please.
Was there a bill this year that, restored voting rights to felons upon release from sentence?
It's constitutional amendments, and it has to be voted on. Is that correct? Am I getting my facts?
Yeah.
It has to be.
So there is a proposed constitutional amendment that did pass in the General Assembly, but there's a big process involved in actually making that an amendment. So it would need to pass the General Assembly again after an election. So we got the election. So once the election happens, the exact same language, can't change the language at all. The exact same language has to pass again in 2026. And then it goes to the voters. So there's many steps in that process. But that will get rid of this weird system that Virginia is the only state in the country that does this, where the governor has to restore the voting rights of felons. And so the governor can either choose to do a lot of that, which was bipartisan for a long time. Bob McDonnell, when Republican Governor Bob McDonnell, one of the things he did as governor is really dramatically expand what his office did in terms of restoring voting rights. But he didn't have to do that. It's his choice to do that. Our current governor is not doing what Bob McDonnell did, and is not restoring as many people. So this amendment would take that out of his hands. But it has to be passed again after the election, and then you all have to approve it in your election.
In terms of voter ID, Virginia does require voter ID, but the voter card that I told you to request from your voter office can be used as ID. So if you have any seniors in your world who don't have a DMV ID, just get that voter card, and that's going to be their ID when they go to vote. And if for some reason they don't have ID, they can currently sign something called an ID confirmation statement that serves as their ID for that election. So.
Was there a question here, Janelle?
I think they have decided to abstain. Are there any other questions on this side?
Oh, here,
Okay, in the back?
Just one moment.
Okay.
I just want to hear a little more about Shelby
Versus
versus
Boulder.
Boulder.
So Shelby versus Holder.
Justice Roberts.
Yeah, was a Supreme Court decision, Shelby County, Alabama, correct me if I get any of this wrong. But basically it overturned the free clearance section of the Voting Rights Act. So part of that was based off the formulas, were declared to be outdated. So we're still using formulas to determine which jurisdiction should be covered, based on 1965 numbers. What that has done in Virginia, the only substantial change to my office in Virginia is we no longer have to go to the Department of Justice to get pre-clearance for things like polling location changes. But because of the Virginia Voting Rights Act, we still, every polling location change or precinct boundary change goes through the county board and has to be, so there are two paths. It either has to go up in front of the county board, not once but twice, so the public can make comments on those changes. If you don't want to go that route, then you have to submit a form to the Attorney General who can sign off on that change, and you have to prove that you're not intentionally trying to discriminate against voters. The reality is that when we were under pre-clearance, every change that Arlington put forward was approved. None of them were rejected, or at least in recent times. And so Arlington had the option, I think Walsh Church took the option of coming out from that section of code. Arlington never did that because we know our history, and why not just get somebody else to sign off on it and not try to go around it. So, but like I said, the actual day-to-day work, there is still not once but twice for voters in Arlington to comment on the change of a polling location or a precinct boundary change. And to your note, every voter in Virginia, if their polling location moves, should get written notification that their polling location has changed. How many of you get mail every day here in Arlington? You guys are doing better than me. I get mail every third day. And so that's where our voter registration, our election system is heavily reliant on the United States Postal Service, and any disruptions and delivery or a mail carrier that's not delivering mail, because we see this where they just want to deliver to an entire apartment building. We can see that they haven't delivered to an entire apartment building, and that can cause problems. So anyway, does that help answer?
Yes, I think it would be valuable though to know that in Shelby County, Alabama, they promptly closed voting precincts where African Americans had traditionally voted.
Yes.
And
So
many of the other southers.
So I said Diane's prompt earlier, we were going to try to keep this to Virginia and Northern Virginia. So I hear you. So we're trying to keep this to, yeah, that's why I responded from the Arlington perspective.
And there's one back there. Okay, yes.
Hi, I had heard about all these federal government trying to get a list of voters.
Yeah.
And I was told that in the state of Virginia, it doesn't list people by party.
That's correct.
So they're just trying to get information, just general information about people who live in.
So what is generally available, I won't say it's publicly available because you do have to be a qualified organization or a person in order to get the list of registered voters in Virginia, but the reality is any number of people can qualify for this list, and you do have to pay for the list in Virginia. But what almost publicly available is your name, your address, your year of birth, sometimes the last 4 digits of your social. That's it.
But not any.
We don't register.
Voting behavior, though, right? I mean,
Voting history.
Yeah.
So but only 2 years of voting history are available for release. So parties who have been requesting this data for the last 40 years, they have a much larger profile of you as a voter than what if you went in today to try to get data from the Department of Elections, what they can release is a much smaller set. So, yeah.
I was gonna say, the other thing is, even though parties may not be indicated, there are areas that are blue states or red states, and so it gives them information without giving them information?
So what Virginia, we don't register by party in Virginia, nobody's declared a party. We're an open primary state. So when we have a primary, you have to declare which party's primary you want to vote, and then you can only vote in one. So the assumption is that if you're choosing to vote in either the Democratic or Republican primary, which is a part of your voter history, we can see if you voted in the Democratic or Republican primary, then the assumption is that you choose to participate in the nominating process of that party, therefore you are that party. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's not always true. I definitely know people, especially in Arlington, we don't always have Republican primaries. So I know people voting in our Democratic primaries here in Arlington.
I think you're also going at the issue of people collecting information about you without your consent, and how is it going to be used? And I think what we're seeing with rhetoric and charges of, well, we are gonna eliminate mail-in voting, et cetera. That's talk, and it's divisive, and it's intended to be divisive. If you want to know what the rules are, you ask the experts, right? You don't go to TikTok, you don't ask your neighbor, you ask the people who know what they're talking about. And if they don't know, they'll find out for you. And all of the rest, as difficult as it is, you just have to ignore, because the purpose is to get you worried or thinking, oh, voting isn't safe, it's fraudulent, my vote won't count, what's the point? To your points earlier about young people, I think a lot of them think, well, what does it matter, you know? So I would say, be vigilant, as Octavia was saying earlier, ask questions, get information, and most of all, vote. Voting is safe. Voting in Virginia is very safe. And it's gone through many, many iterations of making it more accessible and balancing very well that tension between security and access Gretchen was referring to earlier. So I would say it's safe, vote, tell your friends to vote, do the votercade, do whatever it takes, but vote. Okay? All right.
Thank you.
Great. All right, yeah. And thank you to our panelists, Michael Pope, Edwin Henderson. And our esteemed hosts, the League of Women Voters in Arlington and Alexandria. Thank you, Pam and Nancy, for your guidance.
Thank you.